Our season continues as the sun glistens over the dome of the Mandalorian capital of Sundari. Satine and her troops prepared for what would likely be the most arduous day of combat they had ever seen. The morning was calm, and Satine wanted the troops to get as much rest as humanly possible. Of course, what made that difficult was the arrival of the Sith fleet and the ringing sound of flat cannons as they said good morning to their intruders. Satine tried to allow the troops to rest, but that was clearly no longer an option as Sith dropships filled the skies again. Thousands of troops, 2 Sith, and all that stood in their way were a band of Mandalorians being led by a pacifist with a saber that wasn't even the dark saber. Sounds like it should be easy, but Satine and her band of Mandalorians had no intention of making it that way for these intruders. Outside the dome, Darth Zannah and her acolytes stood silently in their own dropship. They didn't use a specialized vessel because, as it turns out, Mandalorians are smart enough to see something that looks vaguely different than everything else. Zannah didn't want her mission to fail, and she wanted the respect she believed she deserved, the respect that belonged to a Sith Lord. Of course, Zannah was nowhere near the front of the landing party, but she did get the pleasure of landing and walking out into a sea of smoke and debris. Her troops piled into the dome and they were held off the main gate. The barricades that the Mandalorians set up were more than enough, but of course it wouldn't last forever. The Mandalorians got to work, and Satine joined her commander as he was leading the men in different formations. The commander kept himself distant from the battle because the Sith were infiltrating across the city, just as he and Satine predicted. Their plans were coming to fruition, however they couldn't get optimistic about the success yet. It was clear that one of the flanks was collapsing. Bo, who was with Satine, immediately jumped at the idea. She told her sister that her unit of Night Owls were leading up to make a move to that sector and cleared out. Satine nodded her head and wished her sister luck. Bo smiled and placed her helmet on with a little twist before the jetpack ignited and she shot off into the battle. Satine told the commander to keep up what he was doing. As she said that, he was launched from his feet. A sniper that took a shot was deterred by a rocket. The sniper in all actuality was aiming for Satine, considering her armor stood out, but he missed because the platform he was on was blown out from under him. Satine cried out, putting her helmet back on and checking the commander to see if he was still alive. He wasn't. Satine leapt back up. She had to use everything she learned from him the last several hours and put it to use. She was concerned though. There was a breaking point that the commander mentioned. If their forces pulled out too early, they would surrender the battlefield to the Sith. If they pulled out too late, they would completely jeopardize their defenses. It was a perfect timing type of thing, and he as an experienced general knew when that time was. He told Satine, but as things go in chaos, she was cycling through 3 or 4 different phases that it could have been. Initially, she believed it was when the Sith got close, but maybe it was when they were down a number of troops. All she knew is that as she helped the wounded away from the ramparts and continued acting as target practice for the Sith, she couldn't remember what it was. Satine did keep up a good line though. Her troops were the most united across the battlefront, and a good part of that was due to her morale boost. Of course, as the battle continued and more waves of Sith troopers filed through the ramparts, she began to question where Pre-Vizsla was. His injury wasn't much worse than the one she sustained the day before. He was either intentionally avoiding her, or he wasn't interested in the battle. She couldn't figure out why, but maybe he was up to something positive. One could only hope. Satine rounded the corner and looked out to see the heavy tanks making their landing on the platforms. She knew this is where they retreated. Satine called out to her troops across the line and told them to break backwards. She stood in her white armor as she directed orders to the troops. Sith troopers targeted her, but she was able to slyly evade their attacks. Her troops broke back to the final line of defense. While the Mandalorians knew it was happening, the Sith didn't. Darth Zannah saw their victory closing in. The first couple blocks of residential buildings looked normal. The only thing missing were the people. For Zannah and her troops, they naturally assumed that the Mandalorians evacuated the civilians and abandoned the outer layer of the city. They would soon wish that was the case. Zannah told her men and the Acolyte to push forward. The Acolyte issued out orders across the lines and the troops all responded readily. It was becoming very obvious that since the Mandalorians hadn't fought for nearly 2 decades, that they were a little rusty. Of course, the refugees weren't helping much either. It looked like a really dire situation for the Mandalorians as the Sith Empire pushed further. The heavy tanks broke through the first block of city streets and residential areas, and then Satine ordered the trap to be pulled. The tanks and Sith troopers exploded. It wasn't one blast around the first blocks across the city, it was her entire segment in particular. The other Sith troopers hadn't gotten that far into the city yet, or were already blown to hell and didn't have a chance to radio it in to the others. Satine could see the panic ensue, and she had to make a mature tactician decision. Of course, seeing the enemy troops rout makes you want to chase them down, but she couldn't. It would sacrifice the protected locations. The Sith troopers under Zannah didn't rout for long. She knew that the leader of the Mandalorians was in front of her, and she pressed further. She ordered a wing of fighters to break through a set of traps on the other side of the potential districts. If they could get those bombs ignited, they could progress and take out these Mandalorian warriors. It'd be that simple. Zannah admired her own strength in this process, and she held the troops off long enough for the fighters to break into the dome and set off the traps. It took his time, and when the fighters broke in, the Mandalorians and refugees panicked. Satine tried to keep them steady, but it was hard. She then noticed that a safe spot for her troops to hide at would be the top of those buildings. If the jetpack troops could get up there, they could deter the fighters. Though it was already too late. The fighters weren't used for anything other than kamikaze attacks. Their whole purpose was to set off the chain of bombs that got in the way. As the booby traps were exposed and the Mandalorians saw the very undoing of their plan, they had to decide what to do. Satine panicked. She looked at her troops and realized that all their lives sat in her hands, as if they didn't already. But this is the moment she realized how important it was to get this right. Satine could see the heavy Sith tanks creeping into the residential district, which was nothing but rubble and destruction at this point. She thought for a moment. The residential area was safe, and the Sith thought it was safe to enter. Make it not safe. She quickly rounded up the troops' inner quadrant and gave them orders. She told the refugees to use ramparts as cover. Without Mandalorian armor, they were exposed. Mandalorians, on the other hand, would break into the sector, use anything they could to create a firing line. They knew the city better than anyone else. Use it to their advantage. If they could cripple their tanks and the heavy vehicles, they could win this. It could also give the refugees a chance to survive and give them a better shot being effective against the Sith troopers. She told them they didn't have much time to do it, so her orders went out quickly and the Mandalorians broke out of the ramparts as the freedom fighters ran to the ramparts to continue their fight. On the far side of the flank, Darth Zannah was leading his troops into an offensive attack. He had no permission to do so, but he took command after a captain in the sector was taken out. He told the Mandalorians and the refugees to attack and head into battle. It was the worst thing he could have ever done. The Sith troopers had the same strategy, and without Gar being privy to the traps laid throughout the residential areas, he ran his men into them. When the Sith fighters came barreling in through the dome and used the same kamikaze tactic, it completely wiped out an entire flank of fighters. Darth Zannah and a couple thousand warriors died instantaneously. The bomb shook the dome, and Bo-Katan, who was in the area, acknowledged how desperate the situation had become. She couldn't get in contact with her sister because she was currently being followed by a couple Sith fighters. Satine was none the wiser to Gar's flank, or even that he had taken command. She had no trust for the Death Watch or anyone who served with them, and now they were costing Zandari a chance at survival. Satine and her troops were able to get to the residential area and prepare a trap for the Sith, but they were a little too late. As they got to their positions, the Sith army had already begun unloading into the ramparts where the refugees were. Satine ordered the counterattack, and it did work. With rockets on their backs, the Mandalorians were able to cripple the front line of the Sith tanks and make it so that the surviving tanks couldn't break through. It was another line of ramparts in essence, and as the Sith troopers noticed what was happening, they began their own counterattack. They fired back at the Mandalorians, and when the Acolyte joined them, he ordered a full-on assault, demanding that they get into hand-to-hand combat. His lightsaber ignited, and Satine commanded her father's sword and ran forward. The Mandalorians cried out in a battle cry, their jetpacks flying them into combat, and all the Sith army could do was hope and pray they came out on top. The Acolyte, on the hand, targeted Satine. Her defining armor made her an easy target, and he was going to make an example of her. The Acolyte and Satine engaged each other. The initial strike was jarring for her. The last time she used full speed like this was when she was still a teen fighting against her father. This would be much harder than it was before. It didn't help that the wound that she had was in such a critical location, such as her ribs. For most of the day, she was able to avoid thinking about it, but she couldn't now that she was viciously defending herself with a weapon like a sword. The Acolyte and Satine drew the attention of those around them, and the battle continued to intensify. Darth Zannah watched in pride. She could feel it. Well, at first it was victory. Now it was something else. Zannah was standing in front of the gate, and a massive explosion triggered her reaction to turn around. She hadn't seen that before. Oh no. It was a Republic. Her flagship detonated, and when she looked back, the skies were filling with LAATs. Satine was getting messages about the Republic fleet, but she was unable to answer them. She was a little busy at the moment. The troops who were manning the flak cannons decided that the Republic was here to help, and thank the Force they decided that was the case. The Republic jumped in behind the Sith Empire, and they were none the wiser. It came from nowhere, and the reason is because the Republic was en route when Satine sent her distress signal. The Republic just arrived with the closest fleet in the sector. With a number of Venators and support ships, the already crippled Sith fleet was no match. The Republic was already out here with a large fleet to begin with, which meant there was likely a Jedi Master here with them. Zannah panicked as she tried to reach the communication on the bridge of her support ships. She got no response. She began to worry as the LAATs funneled down to landing positions around the dome. With the cannons primed, the gunships quickly took out the dropships for the Sith Empire, which immediately began to trap the Sith troopers inside the dome with no way to escape. They had nowhere to go. The most important positioning of these LAATs was on the flank that Gar Saxon died on, and as they made their way there, the counterattack made itself known to the Sith. Zannah tried to reroute her troops to defend themselves, but it fell out from under her as she watched the final ships of her fleet crush under the Republic fleet. Satine, on the other hand, was on her back. She was defending every strike, but when you got a sister like Bo-Katan, Satine was in good hands. Bo came barreling around the corner like a loth bat out of hell. Her jetpack sped her towards the Acolyte as she prepared to strike Satine, which truthfully, with her armor, wouldn't have done all that much. Bo's shoulder slammed right into his ribs, and the cracking sound could have been heard from across the city. The Acolyte was launched from his feet as Bo came back around to her sister. The Sith troopers were beginning to realize that they were trapped, and yet a number of Mandalorians hadn't realized that there were reinforcements coming to save them. The Sith troopers began their retreat, and as they did, they looked death in the eyes. Darth Zannah ignited her lightsaber, preparing for her final stand. The reason her lightsaber was ignited was a Jedi Master made himself present. He was leading his troops, and his blue lightsaber sent rage through Zannah's body. She looked at Jedi Master Plo Koon and the clones that he was leading with pure rage as she launched herself across the battlefield and engaged him. Plo blasted his lightsaber against hers and forced her back as the men of the 104th plowed their way through. The Mandalorians saw these men as allies, and they quickly got themselves out of the way. Satine, on the other hand, prepared to finish off the Acolyte, who was again up trying to kill the Mandalorians. She looked at him as her troopers made their way back to the ramparts, where the rest of the refugees were. She used her jetpack and sped forward with the sword ignited. The weapon slashed him across the leg as she launched herself up into the air. Satine didn't have time. Lowering her back, a rocket launched from her jetpack and smashed the Acolyte in the face, killing him on impact. Satine lowered herself to the ground and pushed Bo towards the ramparts. She turned around to see the clones quickly getting into the mindset of city fighting. Their tactics and years of training were put to good use as they squatted up and began to hunt down the Sith troopers. In the middle of all of it, Plo Koon and Darth Zannah were going head to head. She was quick on her feet, using her blade to try and end Plo, but even Plo wasn't trying to kill her. He told her that she could change. There was no reason to die for the cowardice Sith Empire. She was engulfed in fury. Her blade sped forward, clipping and slashing Plo's blade. His backpedal and finesse were perfect. Each counter move was calculated before she even made it. In her mind, she knew she wasn't a match for him, and he knew that too. He was hoping that she would see it before she ended up dying for no reason. That didn't come though. Her blade and her strikes got heavier and more aggressive the more time went by. Plo gave her chance after chance, but when she jabbed for her stomach, he did what he had to do. As the clones were killing the remainder of her force around her, she was hit with a 3-point saber combo. Zannah lost her grip on the first strike, and the blade fell out of her hand. In the third one, she was slashed across the chest and dropped to the ground. As she fell, she looked at her flagship as it descended to the ground and exploded in a flash of fire. Her fight was over. The clones were able to rout the survivors of the Sith Empire to the underparts of the city. That wouldn't do them well because there are some other Mandalorians throughout the city waiting for them. Sundari was a mess. Satine took off her helmet and watched as the clones sped through the gates looking for Sith troopers. Commander Wolf came up to her and asked if there were any undefended locations that needed to be checked out. Satine looked at Bo, who was quick to point out where they needed to go. Satine walked to the rubble of her city. When she was last in this position, she was just a girl. She was a new duchess after her father's death. It brought back a lot of pain for her, and she sort of stood there in a perplexed position. Thousands of her people had died, but they saved the planet. She looked at everything and felt terrible shame. However, she was much more grateful that her people fought for themselves, rather against themselves. If it was a civil war, then it would make all the death all the more worse. But these Mandalorians ensured that Mandalore would survive. Because of them, there was a future for their people. Plo Koon, after killing Darth Zannah, walked over to Satine and asked her how she was doing. She told him that her only concern was her people. They would make it, but the war would bear a lot of pain for them, especially those who survived the previous war. Plo agreed, and he told her that whenever she had a chance, he would like the chance to talk to her about something. She nodded her head, and she told him to make his way to the palace. She would accompany him. Before he left, she apologized for the lack of civility. He shook his head. He applauded her for her work. He understood why there weren't such pleasantries. Plo Koon was surprised when he reached the palace to find a number of Mandalorians with blue armor standing guard outside of it. He walked past them into the halls. All the refugees had been cleared out, but their stuff still remained. Plo could hear someone yelling on and on about something and how he's going to make her pay. When Plo walked through the doors, he saw Pre Vizsla standing in the room holding the legendary dark saber. He was going on a tangent. The blade wasn't ignited, he was just holding it. He pointed the blade at Plo and called him Jedi scum. He demanded to know why he was here. Plo said he was waiting for the Duchess. A crazed laugh left Pre Vizsla's mouth. He said he could finally kill her and become ruler of Mandalore. Plo begged the question, asking how long that would last him. Pre hadn't gotten far, but Satine saved her people from one war and just won a second. How exactly would they accept him as their leader? Pre ignited the blade and laughed, telling Plo that he was lucky he only wanted to kill Satine, because if he wasn't saving his energy, then he would gut Plo. Plo just looked at the Mandalorian with a serious tone and told Pre that he had no intentions of being the Mandalorian ruler. This set Pre Vizsla off. "Oh, so you think you could just threaten him?" Plo shook his head. He said it wasn't a threat, it was a guarantee. However, he had no interest in being the Mandalorian leader again, so as it turns out, Pre Vizsla was out of luck. This pissed him off. Plo insinuating that he could just win so flawlessly made his anger rise, but he knew he couldn't play patty cake with Plo and attempt to fight Satine after, so he let it slide. His blood pressure, on the other hand, did not. Satine was across the city, not even thinking about Vizsla. Her thoughts were on her people and helping them. She wasn't wearing her helmet, but she was tending to the wounded, asking survivors and refugees if they needed anything, getting an update on the people from under the city, and so on. She didn't leave the front lines immediately. She did everything she could because that's what she specialized in as a leader, leading. After she was out with her people for a little while, she and Bo-Katan returned to the palace so that they could talk with the Jedi Master about the potential of Mandalore joining the Republic. They walked in through the doors. Satine stopped before they got to the throne room. She looked at her sister and told her that she was really glad that she was here. Bo smiled and thanked Satine. From older sister to younger sister, she loved her. The feeling was mutual. Satine told Bo that she wanted to forget about all their time apart. She just wished that they could be sisters again. Bo smiled and nodded her head in agreement. She would like nothing more than that. Satine smiled and turned to open the door, and when she did, she looked at Pre Vizsla. He turned around with madness in his eyes. Satine asked what he was doing, and he told her that he was waiting for her. She asked why he wasn't on the front lines with his men. Pre told her that he was going to kill her, so that he could become the true ruler of Mandalore. Satine was so confused. He looked like a bumbling idiot. So he came back to the palace because she wanted him to heal, and then he decided that instead of helping his people, he was more concerned about being called a leader and killing the true one. Did she get that right? He snarled. The other Mandalorians in the room looked at Satine and realized that perhaps she was right. They didn't agree with her pacifist ideology, but more than anything, that just seemed to be propaganda made by Pre Vizsla to get people to join his clan of crazed maniacs. He fed off the perception of the Duchess, and it turned it further against her. Pre ignited the darksaber and told her to face him. She shook her head. She told Pre that there would not be bloodshed shared in her throne room. Plo Koon admired her for staring into the eyes of death itself after fighting a long battle and surviving it. Bo stood up for her sister and told him that he wasn't a real Mandalorian, he was a fraud. Pre pointed the blade at her. He said after he guts her sister, he'd make her death insufferable. Bo grabbed her pistols, but Satine put her hand down. She lowered them. She told her sister not to stoop to his level. Pre told Satine that if she didn't accept the challenge, then she wouldn't be considered the true ruler of Mandalore. She refused to accept the challenge, and then he ran forward. Satine didn't buckle. She looked him dead in the eyes, and he swung violently. Bo reacted, her eyebrows shooting open, and she pulled her pistols, but it was too late. He swung, but nothing happened. Satine didn't drop to the floor. She didn't die. She didn't even blink. Pre's eyes opened after realizing that he didn't make contact. He turned his head, and Plo Koon was standing on the other side of the room, holding his hand out ever so gently before pushing him backwards. His boots slid across the ground. Pre yelled out, telling the Jedi he had enough of this. Why don't we see how tough the Jedi is without the Force? Satine snapped. She knew he wouldn't stop unless he was stopped. She demanded that Vizsla stop what he was doing. He egged her on, begging the question, or else. Satine grabbed the sword that belonged to her father. Bo looked at her and shook her head. Pre had so much more experience fighting than she did. Satine nodded her head. She told her sister that no matter what happens, Mandalore is ready for a stronger future. They were united, and that's all they needed. She was willing to die if it meant that her people could be united. Bo asked what she meant, and then it clicked when she saw the look of determination in her sister's eyes. Satine didn't believe she could win, but she believed Bo could. The keys to the kingdom were hers, and if Satine lost, then Bo could challenge Vizsla, take the blade from him, and become the Mandalore. Bo shook her head. She pleaded with her sister. Satine ignited the weapon and told Pre Vizsla that she challenged him for the darksaber. He grinned. He turned back around and looked at the Duchess. This would be too easy. How pathetic. How could she think that she could beat him? The two of them looked at each other. Satine closed her eyes. She was a kid again. Her father was standing across from her. He told her that he wasn't going to go easy on her. She smiled slyly and told him that she wouldn't go easy on him, old man. When Satine opened her eyes, she looked at Pre Vizsla. His jetpack ignited and he leapt forward with full speed. Satine quickly defended herself as she dipped to the ground. He glided over her head, swiping and knocking a small lock of hair from her head. It was egregious. How could he do that? Vizsla landed and ran forward, All of his rage, resentment, and anger showed as he swiped. Satine knew it'd be impossible to match him blow for blow, so she avoided it. He swung heavily, and the blade slammed into the ground. She ducked back as he swung forward. Each step she took, he was more off balance. Satine used her grapple on her armor and shot it around his legs. He cut the wire, but as he did, he toppled over it. She didn't go for the kill. It wasn't in her nature. If she could win, it'd be through his own mistake. Satine let Vizsla rise to his feet, and he demanded, yelling that she fight back, but she refused. He swung viciously forward, and she slipped away, the darksaber clashing off her chest plate. She kicked her leg forward, catching him in the stomach, but with the armor on, it was almost an inconvenience. He pushed forward, trying for anything, but as he did, he lost grip on the darksaber. He wasn't going to play nice. He pulled out his pistols and shot forward. Satine quickly opened a shield that sat from her wrist, similar to Bo's armor, and defended herself until Vizsla got the blade and leapt up into the air. His jetpack aided him, and as he sat high in the air above the Duchess, he swung down. Satine saw her opportunity. She flung her mother's pistol into the air as it smacked Vizsla in the head, and he lost focus. His neck slammed backwards, and Satine threw her blade upwards, and put her arm over her head to protect herself. She had reason to believe this would work. Vizsla slammed down on her saber. His torso was pierced. He landed directly on the soft spot within his armor. He raged. He was angry. He slipped off the blade and swung around violently. As Satine, just as shocked as anyone else, backpedaled away. Vizsla did just as she hoped he would, beat himself. While he was dying, he continued swinging violently as a means to hopefully kill her or something. It didn't matter. He was losing consciousness, and he slipped to the ground and told her that she would never be Mandalore. She looked down with shame. She extinguished her blade and held it. The darksaber rolled out of Vizsla's hands, and his pulse went lifeless in front of everyone. Satine knelt down to his side and whispered an old Mandalorian saying in the old language as a way to hopefully give him peace in the afterlife. The Mandalorians chanted Satine's name, and they began to kneel. Satine put her hand up. She told them all that she may have won, but they did not have to kneel to her as such. Her victory was a victory for Mandalore. She reached down and held the darksaber in the same hand with her father's blade. Bo came to her sister's side and told her that she was the Mandalore. Satine nodded her head. She knew that, but it didn't matter to her. The darksaber was nothing but an artifact. To hold it didn't mean anything other than she could hold it, aside from the other blade that she already had. Satine took a deep breath. She said that her wound probably opened up again. She smiled at her sister, and Bo smiled back. They did it. Satine turned her attention to Plo, who was walking up to her. She asked the Jedi Master about what potential the Mandalorians had of having consistent Republic assistance. He told her that consistent Republic assistance was unlikely. However, there was an initiative he wanted to talk to her about. She nodded her head and listened to him as he explained the goal and platforms in the space stations the Republic was constructing. It was at the very least a frontline defense. And he suggested that with the Mandalorians finally united, they likely wouldn't have any trouble with fighting off the Sith again. She smiled, but they both knew the truth. Darth Zannah wasn't the top of the Sith ranks, and her death only made a target for Mandalore that much larger. Satine asked Plo to come over to the briefing table they'd set up in the throne room, and she asked about where the Republic was going or what their strategy was. Both stood side by side with her sister as they listened to the Jedi Master convey the plan. They weren't looking to just recapture planets, but they were also looking for a legendary weapon. Satine placed her hands on the table, releasing the grip of her father's blade and the darksaber. She asked what they were looking for. Plo told her that it was called the Starforge. Truthfully, the Starforge and Mandalorians were related in some way, but like many other cultures across the galaxy, they kept it a secret. Well, not they, someone far down the line in Clan Kryze. Satine said that the secret of the weapon was passed down from generation to generation, but she never learned of it. Her father told her that someday he would tell her, but not the day. She believed it was something she would learn on her 18th birthday, which was ironically true, but never came to fruition. Plo asked her if she had any information regarding the Starforge. Satine shook her head, expressing that if she did, hold on, ancient weapon? Well, it's perhaps possible the sword given to her by her father had the answers. Plo looked down at the weapon, as did Satine and Bo. There were engravings all across it, and some of those engravings were hieroglyphics. At the base of the sword, there was a circular section that had 4 wings on it. Plo asked if she'd ever tried to open that particular piece. She shook her head, but she pulled it up to her face and read a small translated piece. It seemed that over the years, as the language changed from Old Mandalorian to Galactic Common, her family made sure it was legible for whoever needed to know. Satine twisted the circular piece and the weapon vibrated, and so she dropped it. In front of the 3 of them, the blade transformed. The blade became less sharp and extended. There were uneven pieces on it, and at the top of it was a small sphere-like object. It lit with a blue haze, the same color as Clan Kryze. Plo asked her if she understood any of it. Satine looked over it. Through all of her years of learning and dedication to learning the people's language, even this was too far back for her to understand. She read through it and picked up on a couple letters. It seemed as if there was a planet with the name L on it, or maybe there was a star system. She wasn't sure. It was all too difficult to decipher. She flipped it over and read through what seemed to be a step-by-step instruction for it. Or she couldn't really actually tell, honestly. Plo told her that he understood the weapon belonged to her family. Before he could finish what he was going to say, she handed it to him. If the Republic was trying to find the Star Forge, there wasn't any time to waste. Satine brought Plo with her. She said that she had a number of drives that had information on it. She could try and decipher it for him, and Plo told her that it would likely be easier for the Jedi Archivist to go through the drives she provided and see if they could find anything. She agreed and quickly retrieved them. She asked Master Plo if there was anything she or her people could do for the Republic, and he shook his head. Plo told her that she and Mandalore have already done so much. They provided a light to the galaxy, one that hadn't been seen since the fall of Coruscant. With an individual planet being able to stand up to the Sith, others would rally. Of course, Mandalore now had a target on his head, but they would be ready. Satine told Plo that she was grateful for his assistance, and his response to their call for help. He told her that they did all the work, he just cleaned up what they had left. They bowed to each other, and Plo took the sword and the drives with him. The Republic wouldn't fully vacate from the planet. Plo would leave behind 2 Venators and a couple support ships until the Golden Platform was completed. For Satine, she took the Darksaber and brought it before her people. She told them that the weapon wasn't a sign of leadership. It was a symbol, and it was an ancient relic. She was with her people. They would rebuild Mandalore, as they had before. They would be prepared for the Sith if they came again. And they would continue to inspire people around the galaxy. Bo stood by her sister's side and looked on with pride. Satine raised the blade over her head and told her people that they were Mandalorians. They would never go silently. They were victorious. She then reminded them to stay strong. What came next would be arduous, but they would make it. As Satine said this, a chant began. It started from members of Death Watch, but it crept its way through the crowd, young and old, Mandalorian and refugee. They all chanted out one word, calling Satine what she always was and forever would be, the Mandalore. And that, my friends, is part 4 of Season 2. Again, special thanks to Gallivan Gaming, Tristan Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo 670, Anikush, Dank Runner, CT7567, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Malik, John Ndaguin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeek Gamer, Lord Calic, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Fortress Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, The Man with 3 First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Early access updates are on the Patreon. Go check it out. The Sith Clone Wars next episode is next week. I hope you all enjoyed. Anyways, no spoilers. I love you all. Spread the love. And always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.